why Magnus Carlsen is considered as the GOAT, the greatest of all time. We are going to check it out by looking at a game played in 2015 of 24th of April in the Gashimov Memorial between Magnus Carlsen versus Vladimir Kramnik. And this game is such a good game. At the first glance, you are thinking like nothing special, yeah? Because many players think that the game is special when a player makes a sacrifice. But after watching this video, you are going to learn that even if a player doesn't make a sacrifice, just look at the positional play. You're going to understand it, why Magnus Carlsen is considered as the GOAT. Okay, so let's check it out. So, first of all, Vladimir Kramnik is also a very strong player, former world champion, but Magnus Carlsen is the current world champion. In 2015 as well. So let's check it out. So Magnus with the white pieces started out the game with 1 e4, and Vladimir Kramnik with the black pieces replied with e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, royal Lopez opening. Knight f6, d3, Magnus keeping the position as solid as possible. Bishop c5, c3, castle, castle, d6. And the idea of playing c3 in the position is it opens up the white options to play b4 or even try to play d4, grabbing more space on the center. h3, stopping bishop to g4 ideas. Knight to e7, d4, bishop to b6. If black captures, then after cd4, white is already better because now white is having 2 pawns in the center against black 1 pawn. So that is why bishop b6, bishop d3 protecting the e4 pawn, and now comes d5. And from here, the real game begins. First of all, let's check it out. What is the idea of playing d5 by Vladimir Kramnik? The idea of playing d5 is, first of all, you cannot capture the d5 pawn because after e4, your one piece is dead. Second, if you try to capture the pawn on e5, for example, knight e5, then I can go for capturing the e4 pawn. And if you go for capturing the pawn with the pawn, hitting the knight, then I can go by playing knight into e4, and it's still an equal position. So, what Magnus Carlsen thought is, at the place of making the position simplify by capturing one of the center pawns, which many players actually does in the lower level, he first played knight to d2, a very nice move, defending the pawn on e4, and the d4 pawn is already very defended by the two pieces. So we have d4 by Vladimir, knight to e4, knight e4, bishop e4, and now we have e into d4 by Vladimir Kramnik. So Vladimir decides to make the position all simplified. The reason he tried to make the position simplify is, after e into d4, if white captures the pawn with the knight, then after bishop takes, queen takes, pawn takes, you see the d4 pawn is now an isolated pawn and black is already slightly better. If you don't capture the pawn with the knight, if you try to capture the pawn with the pawn, you see the pawn is still an isolated pawn, and I can continue the game by playing c6, not allowing you to push the pawn to d5, and now the d4 pawn is a permanent weakness and black is already better. So after e into d4, what Magnus Carlsen thought is, he first tried to play queen to c2. His idea is he's first hitting the pawn on h7. So definitely capturing the c3 pawn means like white can first play rook d1 hitting the queen, and after queen e8, bishop into h7 check, king h8, and I think white is already very good. So first, Vladimir decided to play h6, keeping the king as safe as possible because king is everything in chess. And now here we have a4 by Magnus Carlsen. The idea of playing a4 is, white wants to play a5, and after bishop to c5, b4, and you can say that after bishop to d6, I can go for capturing the pawn on d4. I got more space on the queen side, and now the position is equal, and I think white is simply better. So after a4, black decides to play c6, making a square for the bishop to go back. Many of you were thinking what will happen if black simply captures the pawn on c3. After d into c3, I'm going to first play rook d1, hitting the queen. The queen have to move, and now I'm going to simply capture the pawn on c3. It's a pawn sacrifice, but in the exchange, you can already realize that white pieces are tremendously active. The rook is on the open file, and I can simply play bishop a3, pinning up the knight, and I think the game is already over for black. So definitely impossible for a human to go for this, although engine still defends it. Vladimir plays c6, a more human move. Idea is to go back with the bishop at some point because the dark squares are already very weak. Rook d1 by white. Now finally you see, Magnus decides to play rook to d1, keeping the attention on the board, and now he's finally prepared to capture the d4 pawn with the knight, as the rook is protecting the pawn. So after rook d1, black plays knight to d5, coming in with the knight. And perhaps the option can be to capture the pawn on c3 now. So now finally we have knight into d4. Rook to e8. Capturing the knight in this position is definitely a bad idea. You are basically giving up a very strong bishop for the knight. You see the dark squares are completely weakened, and you are simply giving up the bishop, so it doesn't make any sense. After rook into d4, the knight is already pinned, and I can simply play c4 and the knight is dead and it's winning for white. So rook e8, developing the piece, and now we have a5 by Magnus. And now the pawn is dead, hit by the bishop and the queen. So Vladimir decides to capture the pawn. Capturing the knight, still the same scenario, c4 winning for white. I think even white can even go for capturing the knight in this position, but it makes the position equalized because it's an opposite color bishop. But c4 is already tremendously strong move from the white side. So after a5, Vladimir decides to capture the pawn on a5. Now what's the idea of Magnus Carlsen for giving pawn sacrifice? After bishop into a5, now Magnus played knight to f3. I'm sure that if you learned some of the basics of the chess, you must have came with a topic overloaded queen, or you can say overloaded piece. The reason is, you see, the queen is currently defending the bishop, currently defending the knight, and let's see what will happen in the future. After knight f3, white is now preparing to play c4, hitting the knight. Black plays b5, the only defense for black to take control of the c4 square. You can't move the knight, the queen is hanging by the rook. And if you try to move the queen from like c7, then I think after bishop d5 pawn takes, I can play queen f4. The bishop is attacked, the rook is attacked, and I'm going to get a piece. It's winning position for white. So b5 the only way for black to defend the position, and now comes knight to d4 by white. Now Magnus first came back with the knight, forcing black to play b5, making the c6 weak, and now jumping again with the knight. And now the target is to capture the pawn on c6, as there is no pawn on the b7. So after knight to d4, in the game we have bishop to c7 by black, by Kramnik, because so that the rook would never attack the bishop now. Although the best move from the black side was to play bishop to b7, defending the pawn, and after bd5, you can't capture the bishop with the queen because the bishop is hanging on a5. So you have to capture it, and after knight b5, you see the engine says that it's an equal position, but just look at from a practical view, the d pawn is isolated, the a7 pawn is completely weak, and you can say the bishop is trapped in his own side, and I'm still putting pressure on the bishop and the pawn. So from the practical view of the human move, human nature, it's already a very bad position from the black side. So we have bishop to c7 by Vladimir, pulling away the bishop. But the pawn is now hanging on c6. If black tries to defend the pawn by playing something like queen c7, defending the pawn, now I can simply play rook into a5, a tremendously strong move by Magnus. This was his idea. You see, the queen is now overloaded. He have to capture the bishop. He have to capture the rook. And after capturing the rook, I capture the pawn on c6, hitting the queen. And now the knight is also hanging up. So, like for example, if you try to move the queen on a4, after a queen trade, bishop into d5, I'm simply a piece plus, and it's winning for white. So queen c7 is not possible, so that was the reason. Magnus sacrificed a pawn. And you see, if the bishop would have been on b6, the position would have been completely fine for black. But the reason the bishop was on a5, the queen was not unable to move. That is why bishop c7, and now comes knight into c6 by Magnus, capturing the pawn, hitting the queen. The queen is forced to move, and now comes g3 by white, because black was preparing to play queen to h2 check, and it's already game over if white doesn't defend it. So g3, and now comes bishop to b7 by black. After playing bishop b7, many of you are thinking, what will happen if black goes for capturing the knight? After capturing the knight, I can play bishop into d5, and I'm hitting the rook and the queen, and it's winning position again from the white side. That is why bishop b7, and now we have bishop to f4 first, because many of you will go for capturing the knight. But now comes bishop f4. Just every piece of Vladimir Kramnik is simply overloaded. The knight cannot capture the bishop, the queen is hanging. The queen is forced to move. The knight is still hanging. So we have queen into c6, capturing the knight, which was a blunder. The right move was to play queen d7, which was impossible to find, because there are so much things happening in the position. Playing with the black pieces is simply a terrible position. Yeah, the knight is hanging, the queen is attacked, white knight is hanging. So perhaps capturing the knight makes sense. Queen d7. The reason queen d7 is not a human move, but it is the perfect move. With things like after rook in d5, black is still going for capturing the knight, so it's the same scenario if we directly go for capturing the knight. But in this case, after queen into c6, rook e5 hitting the bishop and the queen, I can play queen to b6, and after rook trade, bishop takes queen takes the bishop, rook takes pawn, pinning up the bishop, still bishop into e4 hitting the queen, and after queen into e4, queen into g3 check, fg3, rook into e4, and it's an equal position. This is the whole line, but queen d7 is simply nearly impossible to find. Queen into c6, which was a human move, and now comes bishop into d5 by white by Magnus Carlsen. Queen is still attacked, the bishop is attacked. Very hard to play. Rook e1 check by Kramnik. The idea here is, if white tries to capture the rook, queen into d5, black is threatening a mate, white is forced to play queen e4, and after takes, bishop takes, opposite color bishop, it's a draw. So Magnus played king h2, and here comes queen into d5, sacrificing the queen. If you go for capturing the rook, after rook takes, if you try to move the queen like queen d6, it looks like the queen is still defending both the bishops. But now comes bishop into b7, queen into b7, rook jumps in, pinning up the bishop. Black is forced to defend the bishop, and I can play queen f5, final blow. Pieces are simply overloaded, and I'm simply threatening to mate the black king. Black is forced to play rook f8, and now after bishop c7, I'm simply a piece plus. This is the whole theory. So queen into d5 was played, and after rook into d5, rook into a1, rook d1 takes. Just look at this position. It is basically rook bishop versus queen, which is simply winning for white. So now it's simply a formality for Magnus Carlsen to continue the position. Here we have a couple of moves: rook d8, queen e2, bishop to b6. Vladimir still tried to fight, and now the bishop is also traded. So now slowly and slowly the game continues. You see, g4 is a good move because black is preparing to checkmate the white king. g4, bishop comes, queen comes, bishop goes, takes, king goes, check. You see, there is nothing left, but still a couple of moves were played in the game, and after a great fight by Vladimir, pawn takes, rook comes, king goes, takes, queen goes, rook comes, pawn push. A very good move by Magnus. Pawn takes, capturing the pawn means rook takes, and I think white is still winning, but it's hard to convert it. So Magnus find a tremendously good move. Queen g3. You can't capture and give a check because the rook is hanging. So rook have to move, and now simply g5 by Magnus Carlsen. There would be no checks. The king is completely safe. The black king is simply destroyed. And now pawn takes, queen check. A checkmate is coming up. There is no way to defend it. That is the reason after playing g5 on the move number 49, Vladimir Kramnik with the black pieces decided to resign the game, and the winner is Magnus Carlsen. You see, nothing special in the game, no sacrifices, just a simply positional grind. You see, the critical position starts when black played d5. Just let me take you to the game. D4 was played, and after a couple of moves, we tried to see d5. From here, Magnus Carlsen successfully gave actually no chance to Vladimir Kramnik to take a second breath, we can say. He played knight d2, and after takes, which looks completely natural. Pawn takes, completely natural. Queen c2, the pawn is attacked, so playing h6 is completely natural. a4, e5 is coming up, b4 is coming up, hitting the bishop. Like, for example, like if black plays something like a rook, then I can play a5, bishop goes, b4 comes, knight takes. White is having more space on the queen side. Rook d1. Black is very passive and not a good position at all. So c6, a human move. Rook comes. You can't capture the pawn. The queen is hanging. So black played knight d5. Completely natural move. Knight takes the pawn. Rook comes. Pawn push. Bishop takes the pawn. And bishop takes pawn is actually the best move. If you try to play bishop c7, I can play still a6, a very powerful move. So capturing the pawn was definitely not a wrong move. But now knight f3 by Magnus. b5, stopping c4. Knight goes back, hitting the pawn. Bishop goes back, captured the pawn. Queen comes. g3, stopping a mate. Bishop comes. Queen takes, bishop takes. Check, king moves. Queen takes. And now, you see, there was no mistake of Vladimir Kramnik. But Magnus Carlsen still pulled it off. This is how the chess is. It is not compulsory for you to win like by gaining up a piece. You just need to grind up the position. You just search for weaknesses of your opponent, because in the high level, you see, the players do not simply like blunder a piece, but the player wins by, you can say, by simply increasing up their position and then winning up the game. This is how Magnus Carlsen did it. That is the reason. Actually, every game you see of the top level player, just analyze it deeply, and you will find out that why that move was such a good move played by the opponent or played by a greatest player. This is one of the best game of Magnus Carlsen played in 2015 against Vladimir Kramnik, because Vladimir Kramnik is also one of the greatest player of all time. He has been the former world chess champion. That is the reason I've decided to show you this game. The very interesting game played by Magnus Carlsen. He simply gave no chance to Vladimir Kramnik, and it was a fantastic game, a fantastic masterpiece. So if you like this game, and if this game helped you to increase your chess skills and level, then make sure to like the video, share this video with your friends and chess players, and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you are new to my channel. And make sure to click the notification bell, because I'm going to come up with these interesting videos for like this and you will always get notified if you click the notification bell. And I also post a very interesting gambits like Bank Gambit, like Mr. Food Gambit, my you can say the most famous video on my channel because of all you guys. So if this video again helps you to increase your chess skills, then keep sharing, keep posting. Until then, stay tuned and keep watching One Shot Chess.